10 years ago, I published The Undying Stars, which has as its subtitle, The Truth that Unites the World's Ancient Wisdom and the Conspiracy to Keep It From You. Why is there a conspiracy to keep it from you? Why do I say that? This book contains absolutely world-changing information and analysis that shows beyond any doubt that the world's myths are based on the stars, and that includes the stories that are collected up into what we call the Bible. But I believe a lot of people have a very hard time seeing what I'm arguing, because when I say that the world's myths are based on the stars, what I mean is that the characters and the events in those stories, those mythological stories, including the Bible stories, those characters themselves are based on constellations, and the stories are based on the constellations and the various patterns in the sky, and we are not familiar with the constellations. The constellations are never taught to us, and for the most part, nobody knows the constellations very well. And so it can sound like I'm just making this all up, or seeing things that aren't there, or twisting things around to suit what I'm trying to argue, when in fact, the stories and the characters are based on constellations with very specific characteristics that repeat over and over throughout the myths around the world. And once you start to see the constellations, then you can start to see the connection. And I'm going to show you some of those connections. That's what I show in my books and my videos and in my online courses. The problem is, not only are we never taught the constellations and the outlines, but we're actually given terrible outlines that don't help us at all, that are just confusing, and it's quite possible that they are purposely confusing because the outlines that we're given are so bad. And it's quite clear that in the past, for centuries, a different outlining system was known. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a web page from Wikipedia, which, of course, is a terrible source of information. If you look up Wikipedia on any kind of controversial or conspiratorial subject, you're going to get a completely unhelpful and dismissive entry. Well, when it comes to the constellations, you're also going to be given very unhelpful outlines of the constellations themselves. Here's the Wikipedia page for the zodiac constellation Sagittarius, an extremely important constellation, a very beautiful constellation. And here's what it says about Sagittarius. It says, due to its astronomical interest and its status as a zodiac constellation, Sagittarius is one of the best known constellations and is considered a prominent feature of the summer skies in the northern hemisphere. So it's one of the best known constellations according to Wikipedia. Well, let me ask, just answer this to yourself. How many people listening, raise your hand if you feel confident in drawing the outline of the constellation Sagittarius in the night sky? Just sketching out kind of a rough outline of the stars and how to connect them to show Sagittarius. We are never taught that. Even if you are one of the listeners who knows a lot about astrology, you probably know a lot about Sagittarius, what Sagittarius signifies, characteristics of Sagittarius in people's charts or in the heavens, in the zodiac, but you will probably still be very uncomfortable trying to find Sagittarius in the night sky or sketch it out and show the outline of Sagittarius in the heavens. I don't blame you for that because, as I said, you can go through college, you can even get a graduate degree, and no one will ever teach you the outlines of the constellations, and yet they're so important. In fact, you'll be given terrible outlines of the constellations. Here's what, on this very same page, here's where they give us the outline or an outline of Sagittarius. Right here at the bottom of the page, All the previous ones up above just show a part of Sagittarius, the teapot formation within Sagittarius. That's only part of Sagittarius. Down here, they sketch out a outline of Sagittarius. I'll make it a little bigger. Here's the outline that they offer on the Wikipedia page about this important, best known constellation, one of the best known. Here's the outline that they give you. Wonderful. Can you even remember that if you go out and try and find it in the night sky? It's just a jumble. It makes absolutely no sense. You can't find that in the night sky because you could practically draw a random jumble like that anywhere. Not only is it unmemorable, it has nothing to do with what Sagittarius represents in the heavens, and yet we're told Sagittarius is an archer. Can you see an archer in this jumble of lines anywhere? Oh yeah, we're told Sagittarius is a centaur. Can you see Sagittarius as a centaur from this jumble of lines that's given to you on Wikipedia? No, you can't. In fact, I've discovered that Sagittarius often plays a beautiful goddess. Sometimes a god, sometimes a goddess. The constellations in the myths play figures of both sexes, male and female, but very often Sagittarius is a beautiful female, sometimes a goddess, sometimes a princess, sometimes a beautiful maiden bathing in a pool. But once again, with this outline from Wikipedia, you would be hard-pressed to even understand why Sagittarius is an archer, let alone a centaur, and certainly not a goddess. It's not only unhelpful, it's anti-helpful, it's counterproductive. These outlines that we're given are absolutely terrible. It's like they were designed to mislead you and confuse you and make you give up on ever trying to find the constellations. And it's certainly designed to make sure you never see the connection between the myths and the stars, the characters in the myths, including the stories of the Bible, and the constellations on which those stories are built. So let me show you, here's the alternate. Besides the jumble of lines, sometimes we're also given very flowery, artistic renditions of an outline around the stars. Once again, this is completely unhelpful. At least now we know, okay, we're looking for a centaur who's holding a bow, but you're not going to see this outline in the heavens. You're not going to see this artwork. If you go out and look at the stars, this picture will not help you find Sagittarius any better than that unhelpful jumble on the left. So there was an author whom I consider to be one of the most important authors in the English language. Of course, I'm talking about William Shakespeare. No, I'm talking about the author H.A. Rey. There's H.A. Rey. He wrote, along with his wife Margaret Rey, the Curious George books. And not only did he write the Curious George books, for which he's most well known, but H.A. Rey also wrote a book in 1952 entitled The Stars, A New Way to See Them. And in this book, H.A. Rey said, we are given terrible outlines of the stars. We're either given a jumble of geometric lines, which is unhelpful, or we're given this very flowery outline, which is equally unhelpful. I'm going to give you a different way, a new way to see them. And it turns out he is giving you the ancient way. He never really came out and directly said, this is a very ancient system and this will help you understand the connection to the myths. But the system that he outlines will help you to see the connection between the myths and the stars. So let's look at H.A. Rey's outline for the constellation Sagittarius. I'll put it over here, and here's the outline that he suggests for the constellation Sagittarius. Now, can you see why Sagittarius is an archer? The stars themselves reveal a tremendous bow, and then this figure who has like a triangular head with a plume on top and a long skirt, or it looks like a long dress, and is shooting a bow. And now you can see why Sagittarius is an archer. But you can't really see from this outline why Sagittarius is also a centaur. H.A. Rey's outline doesn't reveal that. This outline is extremely helpful for understanding the ancient myths and seeing why Sagittarius is sometimes a goddess or a beautiful woman. But if you add a few more lines, you'll see why Sagittarius is also a centaur. There's a star down below the level of the bow, and if you connect to that star right here, I'll draw a dotted line connecting to that, you can see why Sagittarius, in addition to being a human figure, could also be a centaur-like figure. Once you connect that line, now we've got like a four-legged animal almost here, and this part of the figure becomes like the horse's body with horse legs and then a human torso with a bow growing out of the horse's body, just like the centaur that you see down below. And in fact, there are stars off to the left. That terrible outline that I showed earlier connects to the tip of what I call the tail. If we draw in another line connecting those stars, that's the tail part of Sagittarius. You can see why the constellation Sagittarius actually plays the figure of the devil or Satan in some of the stories, that devil-like tail. But now it really looks like a horse or some kind of an animal body with a human torso and a bow. The outlines of H.A. Rey help us to unlock the ancient system, even though he never, to my knowledge, disclosed that this is a very ancient way to see them, and it connects to the ancient artwork around the world, and it connects to the myths. But I grew up with the books of H.A. Rey, and I started to see these connections because I know the outlines. That's the outlines that my dad used to take me out to look at the constellations, and these are the outlines that we used. We always had these books by H.A. Rey, and when we went out to the night sky, we would find the constellations using the outlines that H.A. Rey offers, and they're wonderful for finding the stars. And it turns out, as I later started to research the myths and the connections to the stars, the outlines that H.A. Rey offers, if you understand those, you can start to see the connections to the myths around the world. Let's see a few examples. Starting with this outline of Sagittarius, here's a screenshot from the online planetarium Stellarium showing Sagittarius in the night sky surrounded by some of the other constellations in the region of Sagittarius. Let's see that outline again. There's that outline that I showed earlier. That is the outline of Sagittarius. Now, here's a picture of me back in 2016 at the Museum of Fine Art in Boston. There's this beautiful vase. It's from the 400s BC. It's a Greek red figure vase, and on it is a scene from the myth of Artemis and Actaeon. That's the goddess Artemis. She is slaying the unfortunate prince Actaeon, who was so unfortunate as to stumble across Artemis when she was bathing, and Actaeon was turned into a deer, and then he was hunted down by his own dogs. And this ancient vase, it's a crater actually is the correct term for it. I put the picture to show how large it is when I was standing next to it. But if you look at the outline of Artemis, you can see immediately that this ancient artist in the 400s BC is outlining Artemis in the correct position as the constellation Sagittarius, as outlined by H.A. Rey in 1952's The Stars, A New Way to See Them, in his 1952 book, The Stars, A New Way to See Them. Look at the outline of the goddess. Look at the shape of her posture. Look at the bend in her knee, and then look over at the constellation Sagittarius. Can you see how she has her angle of her body is very reminiscent of the angle of the outline of Sagittarius in the night sky. This isn't just me seeing pictures in the clouds. This is very specific. If you look down to her feet coming out below the length of her dress, that's very reminiscent of the constellation in the night sky. Now, one very important characteristic of Sagittarius figures, often showing up in myths and Bible stories, is the constellation itself appears to be walking in one direction and then looking back in the other direction, and shooting the bow and looking back in the opposite direction. So walking one direction and looking the other direction is a characteristic of Sagittarius. And maybe you can think of female figures in Bible stories, perhaps, who are told not to look back, but then as they're walking away, they do look back. Well, Sagittarius, in the sky, the outline itself looks like it's walking one way and then looking back the other way. And then look at this artwork from this crater, from this ancient vase. And the artist has depicted Artemis, the goddess, walking one way and then looking back and shooting her bow the other way, just like the constellation Sagittarius. Now, if we move the arrow up here to where she's holding her bow and arrows, look at the angle, the level at which she's holding her bow. It's not up by her eye. It's kind of like she's holding it sidearm, like gangster style. And look at the level of the bow in the constellation. This artwork clearly indicates that the artist understood a connection between the goddess Artemis and the constellation Sagittarius. I like to point this out. This kind of scabbard or quiver coming up over her shoulder. She's got maybe a quiver of arrows or something, or maybe a sword, like a samurai sword, slung over one shoulder with a little tassel on top. Well, on top, one of the distinctive features of the constellation Sagittarius, I already pointed it out, is right here, this feather coming up from the top of the head. The triangular head of the constellation has this plume or something coming up off the top of it. That features in a lot of different stories and myths around the world. This artist has included it, and in fact, the dying Actaeon, the prince who's being torn apart by his own dogs, I've pointed out that he's actually depicted in the angle of the constellation Scorpio. Let me outline Scorpio. I like to outline Scorpio with multiple heads because in many different myths, Scorpio actually plays not a scorpion, but more of a serpent, often a serpent with multiple heads. Let me show you from the myths of ancient India the story of Krishna and the Kaliya Nag. There's a story about a river in which a mighty Nag or Naga lives, a multiple-headed cobra-like semi-divine snake. And this Nag's name is Kaliya, and he's venomous and he turns the whole river poisonous. It's the river Yamuna. Well, Scorpio, the multi-headed serpent, is actually in a river feature in the night sky. That's the Milky Way itself. Scorpio is right there in the Milky Way. In this story of Krishna and the Kaliya Nag, Krishna dances on the heads of this multiple-headed cobra snake deity, Kaliya. And so here's Kaliya, the Kaliya Nag or Naga, and dancing on his head is the Lord Krishna playing his flute. Now, dancing on the heads of this multiple-headed snake in the night sky is a different constellation. Just above Scorpio, almost as if standing on the multiple heads of Scorpio, is a constellation called Ophiuchus. Once again, most people are not familiar with Ophiuchus unless you've watched a lot of my videos or taken some of my online courses. Ophiuchus is an incredibly important constellation. We're never told or taught any of this. Most people don't know how to find Ophiuchus in the night sky. The best way is to start with Scorpio. Let me outline Ophiuchus. This is the Lord Krishna dancing on the heads of the Kaliya Nag, and the flute, look, Ophiuchus, the name of the constellation means the serpent holder. Ophiuchus appears to be this central body holding a serpent on either side. On one side is a tail, and on one side is the head of the serpent. The tail of the serpent could actually be envisioned as the flute that Lord Krishna is playing off to one side. He's playing a flute off to one side, and right on the tail side of Ophiuchus, which is the eastern side of the constellation, is the serpent's tail that looks like a flute held off to one side of his mouth. In the illustration, there's a flute. It's a very thin line, so I just thicken it up a little bit there so you can see Krishna is often depicted holding that flute. You can see it in many different statues of the Lord Krishna, the god Krishna, playing a flute. That's because he is actually most associated with the constellation Ophiuchus, and Ophiuchus appears to be dancing on the heads of this multi-headed serpent in the sky, Scorpio. That's what this whole story is based off of. Sometimes Krishna also blows a conch shell. The conch shell is probably the serpent's head on the other side. They blow a conch shell. And in the Mahabharata, Krishna blows a conch shell at the beginning of the Battle of Kurukshetra. That's on the other side of Ophiuchus. But can you see how Ophiuchus standing on top of Scorpio gives rise to this story of Krishna dancing on the Kaliya Nag in the river Yamuna? Here's another illustration. You can see the flute a little better in this one. In the story, as Krishna is dancing on the heads of the Kaliya Nag, he starts to assume a greater and greater size and greater weight. In fact, he begins to bring on the weight of the entire universe, and blood starts to drip out of the mouth of the Kaliya Nag because he knows, this must be a god dancing on my head. I just thought it was a human at first. And he starts to beg for his life, and his wives, they look like mermaids in this painting, but they're like serpent wives, come up and they beg Krishna for mercy so that he will spare the life of Kaliya and send him to a different river where he won't scare all the people and poison all the fish and poison all the livestock. And Krishna has mercy on Kaliya. But look at the wives. What constellation could be envisioned as the wife of Kaliya putting her hands together, or the wives, begging Krishna for the life of the Kaliya Nag? As you can see, they're holding their hands together in that Anjali Mudra. That is, again, Sagittarius. So it turns out that the bow of Sagittarius could also be envisioned as praying hands, or the Anjali Mudra, as hands pressed together. You can see it from the illustration. And in fact, in the Bible, there is the story of Joseph, who gets sent down to slavery by his brothers. He gets sold into bondage in Egypt by his brothers, who hate him because he keeps talking about these dreams. And they sell him into these merchants. And this story is often depicted with Joseph with his hands bound together, tied together, and crossed in front of him. This is actually from the early 1100s. This is a very old depiction of the story, but that's Joseph with his hands bound together. Just like Sagittarius could be praying hands, it could also be hands tied together with rope. And in this case, you can see he's being sold to, there's a little caption at the top that says, an Ishmaelite. He's being sold to the Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelite has this whip. He's standing by his donkey cart, or his horse. He's got a horse and a donkey, and he's got a whip in his hands with 3 heads on it. That is the multiple heads of Scorpio again. If you follow that rope that goes from Sagittarius's wrists, if Joseph is Sagittarius, the rope that goes up from his wrists basically gives you the outline of Scorpio in the illustration itself, ending in 3, like a multiple-headed whip. And whips and scorpions, as my friend Mario of Symbolic Studies recently pointed out when he's talking about the sign of Scorpio, and we're entering Scorpio season in the zodiac right now, whips and scorpions are associated with one another. In fact, a whip with multiple tails was called a scorpion, and there are passages in the Bible, in 1 Kings and then again in 2 Chronicles, relating the same story. It's a story about Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam is one of the sons of Solomon, and Rehoboam wants to take over the kingdom after Solomon's death. So Rehoboam is approached by people who say, we've got it really hard. Could you please, lighten our load a little bit? And he asks his old counselors, the ones who actually counseled his father Solomon, and they say, yeah, you should lighten the load of the people. Promise to lighten their load, and they'll really accept you as the king. And then Rehoboam goes to his younger counselors and decides to ignore the older counselors. And the younger counselors say, here's what you should say. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. Whips and scorpions. You can find it if you search the Bible for the word scorpions. Every single time you find scorpions, it's talking about the constellation Scorpio. Even a few times where they don't call it a scorpion, as we'll see in a moment. But you can see this proves that Sagittarius sometimes is envisioned as having hands bound, because Sagittarius and Scorpio, that's Joseph and the Ishmaelite in this painting. Now, some people might say, wait a minute, paintings from the 1100s don't really prove that the Bible stories are based on the stars. The Bible doesn't really have illustrations in the original texts. It's just texts, right? Well, we can go to actual texts and see the stars, the constellations. It's just fun. I like to show it with illustrations. That really drives it home. But we can prove it from the texts themselves. There's another part in Luke where Jesus says, I will give you the power to tread on scorpions. What's that? Ophiuchus and Scorpio again, right? We already saw an Ophiuchus figure treading on a Scorpio figure from Krishna in the Kaliyanog. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus tells his disciples, I will give you power to tread on serpents and scorpions. Interesting. If you go back to Genesis 3, we don't need any pictures. We can go right to the text, and this is the part where Adam and Eve are being kicked out of the Garden of Eden after listening to the serpent. And Jesus says to the serpent, or God says to the serpent in Genesis 3:15, first he kicks the serpent out. He says, look, I'm going to make you crawl on your belly and eat dust. And then he says, and I will also put enmity between thee, serpent, and the woman, and between thy seed, between your offspring, and her offspring, her seed. Between thy seed and her seed, it, her seed, shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. We don't need any pictures to see that this is talking about Ophiuchus and Scorpio. I've done lots of videos and written about this, spoken about this. The woman in this story, I have argued, is almost certainly associated with the constellation Virgo in the night sky. And the outline of Virgo, we never get taught this, and the outline in Wikipedia is a terrible outline, but the H.A. Ray outline shows a woman with an outstretched arm, and then the brightest star of Virgo is Spica, or Spica, in her hip. The second brightest star of Virgo is her outstretched arm, the star that defines her outstretched arm. And as you were probably never taught in school, of course, that star is called Vindimeatrix, and it means the grape plucking or fruit plucking feminine. Vindimeatrix means the female grape plucker or fruit plucker. So that's a good argument that Virgo probably is Eve who plucks the fruit in the story. The seed of the woman, Virgo itself, if you use the right outline, you can see Virgo appears to be a woman on her back with her legs elevated and spread apart. Well, that could suggest having sex, and it does in some myths and Bible stories. It could also suggest a woman in the act of giving birth, with her legs elevated and spread, and the seed of the woman is the one who is born from Virgo, the Virgin in the sky. That would be the constellation Ophiuchus. That's the one that is going to bruise the head of the seed of the serpent. I argue that the serpent, who's the serpent and who's the seed of the serpent? The serpent may well be the constellation Hydra, which is close to Virgo in the sky. It's a very long constellation, clearly looks like a serpent. The seed of the serpent could be Scorpio, or Scorpio could just be the serpent. The verse itself is a little bit ambiguous. It says, he shall bruise your head. So in any case, the seed of the woman being Ophiuchus, the offspring of the woman, bruises the head of Scorpio, but Scorpio will bite his heel. That's what the text says. We don't need a picture to prove that this is based on the stars. It's very clear that Ophiuchus, 1 foot of Ophiuchus is standing right on the heads of Scorpio, and Scorpio's heads are right next to the heel of Ophiuchus. So these are very clear indications that the ancient myths and stories are based on the stars, but we never get taught the constellations, so you would never see this with the terrible outlines that you're given. First of all, you're never taught them. Second of all, if you do go try and learn them, you get these terrible outlines which will not help you see any of this at all. What does it mean? It's absolutely profound and extremely important, but we just can't see it if we're never taught it. It shows that the ancient myths are all related, and none of them are superior to any of the others. The Bible stories have been taken as if they are literal and true and used in a political way to suppress other nations, saying, oh, all you have is false stories. We have to correct that. None of them are superior to any others. They're all using the same system. They can all be shown to be related and connected. And this system is extremely ancient. It predates the most ancient civilizations that we know of. It's already operating and can be seen to be operating in the myths of ancient Egypt and in the earliest artwork of ancient Egypt. I've done a whole video about the Narmer palette, supposedly the very creation of the kingdom of Egypt, the uniting of Upper and Lower Egypt. It's already using this ancient system. Ancient India, we saw some examples of that. The Vedas, those stories can be seen to be using this same system, and they are very ancient. Ancient Egypt, ancient India, ancient Sumer, long thought to be the most ancient of all civilizations. Their most ancient texts and stories, such as the Gilgamesh or Bilgamesh epic and others, the descent of Inanna, they are all using this system, and I have shown that. And the specific characteristics of the constellations can be seen in the artwork, and they can even be seen to be indicated in the texts themselves, in the words themselves. What is going on here? These stories, I've argued, are imparting profound wisdom. They are some kind of very ancient system that comes from something far older than even the oldest civilizations that we know of. And it seems like there's a conspiracy or an agreement among academia to throw out and disregard any evidence of advanced ancient civilizations prior to Egypt, India, and Sumer. This system is clearly ancient, and this evidence stands alongside all of the archaeological evidence pointing to advanced ancient civilizations that are older than the oldest civilizations acknowledged by conventional history and conventional academia. After studying this for over 15 years and trying to understand what is this ancient system doing, why are they using the stars, what is it trying to tell us, I'm convinced that it has multiple levels, and on the individual level, these stories are teaching us profound truths, illustrating for us, dramatizing for us profound truths about ourself, our deeper self, and about trauma that separates us from self and points us towards recovery of self. That is extremely important, a profoundly important subject, and it is clearly going on in the ancient myths of the world. That's why we're drawn to them. That's why people are drawn to the stories of the Bible. They can innately feel that these stories are talking about something important, but when they're taken literally, they actually obscure that message. On the societal level, they are talking about ways to organize society that will prevent parasites from taking over your nation and destroying it. And as it turns out, parasites that want to destroy your nation will also use trauma on the individual level to keep people from seeing what's going on or from being able to effectively react to it. So those two themes on the individual level and the societal level are related. So if you are on the side of parasites trying to take over and devour the resources given by nature or the gods to the people, you don't want people to understand these ancient myths on this deeper level. You don't want people to be able to hear what they're saying about trauma and self on the individual level and about parasites and protecting your nation against parasites on the societal level. And that is a possible explanation for why we have never been taught about the stars. And if you go and try and understand them, you'll be given just terrible outlines that will not help you at all. I've been talking about this now for over 15 years, researching it. My book, Undying Stars, came out in 2014. Now it's 2024. I've written and published about 10 other books since then, online courses. But I feel that people may not be able to grasp it unless they start to really understand the outlines of the constellations. And so that's what I'm trying to show you and explain and outline in my courses, in my books, and my videos. Once you start to see that, then you can start to hear this ancient language that the myths given to all the cultures are speaking and the messages that they're trying to tell us. Thanks so much for listening.